Hello and welcome to section 1 of Honors Biology. This section is all about macromolecules, those large structures that make all the different parts of your cells and lead to all the beautiful diversity we see in our organisms all over the place. And before we get into our macromolecule section, we need to begin with a small dose of organic chemistry, just because we need to get familiar with all the different atoms that are going to be interacting to create these macromolecules. Now, brief introduction. If you look at the periodic table, you're going to see numerous numbers of elements. Of those elements, 92 of them are naturally occurring. Within those 92 naturally occurring elements, 11 of them are found within you. And within those 11 elements, we're getting shorter and shorter now, within those 11 elements, 4 elements make up 96% of your body mass. Can you guess what those 4 elements are? I bet you can. So if you're thinking of us as human beings, you know we're about 70-75% water, so there's hydrogen and oxygen right there. We're carbon-based life forms, so there's carbon, and the last one is actually nitrogen. So if you're looking at your body mass, 96% of your body mass is all because of those 4 atoms. It's interesting to think of your body mass in the terms of atoms, but that's how it works. Oxygen is the one that takes the most credit at around 62% of your body mass. So it's just a fun little fact, but what we really want to focus on is carbon. So before we get into macromolecules and how they're made and what they do and their structures and their functions, we need to talk a little bit about carbon and the different groups that attach to carbon, atomic groups that attach to carbon, to allow us to do these beautiful reactions to create these macromolecules and break down these macromolecules. So let's begin. Remember, I teach in outline form just so you can keep neat, concise notes. Hopefully it works for you, and I hope you write down these notes. If not, save these lectures. I'm hoping they will come in handy later on. So we're going to begin. We're in section number 1, macromolecules, in Roman numeral 1. Is all about the role of carbon. So carbon is an extremely important element. If you look at the periodic table and you find carbon, you're going to see that it's a group 14 element. And in group 14, all the group 14 elements, they all share something similar. Within their valence shell, if you remember from chemistry, your valence shell is the outermost shell that holds your electrons, if you're an atom. And in carbon, its valence shell has 4 electrons. And in biology and chemistry, we call that tetravalent, or carbon has tetravalency, if you will. So that tetravalency gives carbon a lot of its beautiful features and properties. So let's talk about that really quick. So what we have to know is that carbon is tetravalent, meaning it has 4 valence electrons. And that tetravalency allows carbon to have lots of flexibility in all the different structures it can make. And that's the biggest take-home message we need to know about for biology, because that flexibility of carbon to create all these different structures leads to these massive structures that can also have different functions. When we talk about biology, that whole relationship between structure and function is critical. It always works this way. So if a molecule has a certain structure, we can almost predict what its function can be, or we can understand if this structure is off, this function is going to be off as well. So it's a beautiful relationship, and it always goes back to chemistry. So here we go. Carbon is tetravalent, and so this allows carbon to create multiple structures, very flexible structures, and these structures can be ringed, they could be chains, they could, honestly, carbon is pretty sweet. So this allows carbon to be very flexible and create long chains or rings. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. So carbon is tetravalent, allows carbon to be very flexible and create long chains or rings. Okay, I'm going to erase this so I could draw you a picture of what I'm talking about here. So, if you look at carbon, and it has these 4 valence electrons around it. that allows carbon to easily make a covalent bond, a shared electron bond, with multiple atoms. Carbon really likes to attach to itself though. This is what we're going to be studying a lot. So if I have another carbon atom here, these two electrons can easily bond together, and you have a very stable covalent bond. And honestly, this can keep going and going and going, and you have all these valence electrons surrounding carbon. An atom that loves to surround carbon is hydrogen. So most oftentimes you'll see these long hydrocarbon chains that are just saturated with hydrogen. And hydrogen is content with just filling its octet with 2. It doesn't do an octet really. It just needs 2 electrons to be content. So a chain like this, when you see nothing but carbon and hydrogen, we actually call this a hydrocarbon chain. Now, in organic chemistry and biology, we love to take shortcuts whenever we can, because this takes time to draw out. So if you're looking at a chain like this where I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons on hand and hydrogens all around, no other atoms are attached to this besides hydrogen. The shorthand way of drawing this, so if you want to do a shorthand way of doing this, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This structure equals this structure. If you were to draw this in front of any organic chemist or biologist, they would automatically do this in their mind. So what this picture is telling you, every single point that you see here is a carbon. So I have a point here, carbon, 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 carbon. And since there's no other atoms written on this chain, I assume it's filled with hydrogens. So if I was to fill in this drawing right here, this is universal. Everyone knows that this is shorthand for this. But if I were to draw this in, you would know that there's a carbon here, a carbon here, carbon here, carbon here, da-da, da-da. And these lines are representing the covalent bonds between the carbon. You would also know that each carbon has the hydrogens saturating it all over the place. But you don't have to draw this. I'm just kind of putting little meat on this skeleton here, if you will. Okay? But all you would really need to do is go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This means a 6-carbon hydrocarbon chain. Okay? So you're going to be seeing a little bit of both forms of chemical drawings as we go forward in this section. Okay? So the biggest thing I want you to remember from carbon is that it can form long chains. It's very flexible. Having that tetravalency allows it to do many, many cool things. So obviously it can make long chains, but the other neat thing about carbon is that it can actually take these long chains and ring up on itself. So let's show you a carbon ring. And when we get to our macromolecules, we're going to encounter these carbon rings. So carbon can do many things. So to take a long carbon chain and just ring it up on itself, that's exactly what's going on here. So since every atom wants to have an octet, I would just cover this whole thing up. Oops, I just broke the octet rule. I was thinking the end. Here we go. Oops, I was thinking right. I'm thinking of a different compound. So that's the longhand way of drawing something like this. If you ever wanted to draw this the shorthand way, you probably guessed what the shorthand way probably looks like already. The shorthand way would be just to draw your hexagon like that. And every point, you have a point here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Every point on the carbon, on the shape, represents a carbon. And since there's nothing else drawn on it, you can assume there's nothing but hydrogen on there. Okay? So just to get you familiar with seeing how carbon looks like in different forms. It's obviously very flexible. That's the big thing we need to remember. Okay, now we can move on to when you have these long carbon chains, hydrocarbon chains, carbon chains, whenever you have these long carbon chains, other atoms like to attach to it. And this is where we're going to lead into right now. These are called functional groups. These are groups of atoms that attach themselves to these chains. And these atoms are actually the ones involved with different reactions to create these large macromolecules or break them down as well. So let's talk about functional groups. So Roman numeral 2 is functional groups. And whenever I draw a little double arrow like this, I'm going to define whatever this means in front. Okay? So a functional group is a group of atoms that are attached to a carbon chain that are usually involved, not always, they can be, but they usually are, that are usually involved with chemical reactions. Here we go. So a group of atoms attached to a carbon chain that are usually involved in reactions. So that's why we call them functional groups. Their function is to help with the reaction. If there wasn't a functional group on a carbon chain, they would be almost neutral. They wouldn't actually react or do anything like that. So these functional groups help aid reactions. And what we're going to do, we're going to study 6 different types of functional groups. And what you're going to be responsible for is recognizing them when you see them on an organic structure. And an organic structure is honestly anything that has carbon in it. So whenever you see an organic molecule, an organic structure, you're going to see these functional groups on them, and you're going to be able to recognize them right away. And then you're going to realize, here's how they may react to create this macromolecule. So here we go. There's 6 types of functional groups that we're going to study. All right, the first one is called a hydroxyl group. First one is a hydroxyl group. And what a hydroxyl group is, it's honestly an OH. And if you remember from chemistry, you had hydroxide, that kind of polyatomic ion. That's where we get hydroxyl from. A hydroxyl group is an OH that is bound to the carbon chain, covalently bonded to the carbon chain. So this is an OH group, and that's just representing the bond of it attached to a carbon. OH group attached to the carbon chain. So if I were to draw a typical carbon chain, so if I were to draw a 4-carbon chain, and at the end of it, put an OH group, and there's H's all around. This functional group has completely changed the structure and the function of what this 4-carbon chain was. Before we put this OH group, we may have just had a hydrogen there. If I just had a hydrogen there instead of OH, this would have been called butane. Now that I have an OH group, it's now butanol. OH groups also are also known as alcohol groups. So if you ever heard of, isopropyl alcohol, ethanol, stuff like that, that all is representing the OH. So hydroxyl groups are also called alcohol groups. And that honestly changes a lot in this whole structure. They react completely different, as you can tell. One could be a gas, one could be a liquid. It just depends on what it is. So it depends on what structure you're talking about. So that is a hydroxyl group. So this is what we're going to be doing with our functional groups. The first one is a hydroxyl group. And I'm going to bring you back for the next video. We're going to talk about the remaining 5 functional groups. but I wanted you to get a taste of what the functional groups are going to be like. Very simple identification. You're going to get a carbon chain and you're going to get a functional group, and you got to tell me, oh, that's a hydroxyl group. It's not that hard, but then we're going to use them to do really cool things. So thank you for joining me on this section. Come back, we're going to finish up our functional groups.